You will never feel rich no matter how much money you make. At some point, you realized your stress upgraded along with your income, like a loyalty program you didn't sign up for. Most advice pretends this is a discipline problem, when it's really a design problem. There's a quiet psychological system constantly resetting your sense of enough, and it's been doing this longer than you've had a checking account. The cost isn't dramatic collapse, it's decades of feeling vaguely behind while technically doing fine. If you enjoy learning why normal things are secretly dumb, go ahead and like and subscribe so you don't miss the next explanation. We're going to walk through why this happens, how it repeats, and why it never feels like the moment you thought you were waiting for. Number 1, lifestyle inflation cancels out financial progress. Have you noticed that every raise somehow comes with a matching increase in monthly stress? This usually starts innocently, like upgrading one thing because you earned it, which is adult code for I was tired. You make more money, so you move somewhere slightly nicer, get a car with fewer emotional issues, and start paying for convenience because your time is now apparently valuable. On paper, your income went up, but in real life, your breathing room quietly stayed the same or shrank. The math technically works, which is the most dangerous kind of math, because it looks responsible while canceling out the entire point. You didn't lose control, nothing dramatic happened, everything was reasonable in the moment. Lifestyle inflation isn't a spending problem. It's a background process running automatically, like software you never agreed to install. And it would almost be fine if it didn't quietly set up something even stranger right after. Number 2, high earners still experience financial stress. How is it possible to make what used to sound like rich people money and still feel behind? At some income level, you expect the anxiety to taper off, but instead it just upgrades its vocabulary. There's data showing that a huge chunk of people making 6 figures still feel like they're one surprise bill away from collapse, which sounds fake until you remember your own browser tabs. This happens even after adjusting for where people live, meaning it's not just rent or groceries doing the damage. What's actually happening is psychological, not financial, which is frustrating because you can't spreadsheet your way out of it. The stress doesn't come from not having enough, it comes from needing more to feel normal than you used to. You end up working harder to maintain a feeling you thought you were working toward. And once you see that pattern, it's hard not to notice how familiar it feels. Number 3, hedonic adaptation explains why more money stops feeling better. Why does every financial upgrade feel amazing for about 5 minutes before becoming emotionally invisible? There's a name for this, and it's been ruining your expectations quietly for decades. Hedonic adaptation is your brain's ability to adjust to improvements until they feel like baseline, which is great for survival and terrible for satisfaction. You don't stay impressed by raises, nicer apartments, or better gadgets because your brain immediately recalibrates and starts scanning for the next thing. This is why financial stress can repeat at higher incomes with impressive consistency. You're not failing to appreciate what you have, your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do. The problem is that it treats comfort like a temporary condition instead of a destination. And once that baseline resets, it starts asking a very inconvenient follow-up question. Number 4, research shows money's emotional impact plateaus. Isn't it strange that the human brain gets bored of winning? There are studies where people win life-changing amounts of money and after a short emotional spike, report feeling about as happy as they did before, just with better furniture. Raises work the same way, except with more emails. Your brain normalizes upgrades quickly because it's designed to notice changes, not maintain appreciation. So the thing that felt unreal in January becomes just how things are by summer, and your emotional reaction quietly powers down. This isn't a moral failure or a gratitude issue. It's a neurological feature pretending to be a personality flaw. Your brain stops being impressed because staying impressed would be inefficient, and efficiency is its whole brand, which would be manageable if the returns didn't start shrinking right when the effort increases. Number 5, income increases produce diminishing returns on happiness. Doubling your income does not double how good your life feels, and it never did. There's a point where each additional dollar adds less happiness than the last, even though it demands more time, attention, and stress to earn. Early income increases remove real problems like instability and constant anxiety, which feels incredible. Later increases mostly rearrange discomfort into nicer shapes. The research shows happiness rising up to a threshold, then tapering off into something more like emotional maintenance mode. Meanwhile, the stress curve keeps climbing because expectations scale faster than contentment. You end up trading a lot more energy for smaller emotional gains and calling it ambition. And the weird part is, this still doesn't stop the desire to keep going. Number 6, desire is not the problem, automatic upgrading is. Wanting more is not the issue, despite what minimalists on YouTube would like you to believe. The problem is wanting more by default without noticing why, when, or for whom. Most upgrades aren't chosen deliberately. They're triggered by social scripts that say, this is what happens next. You make more money, so your lifestyle quietly updates like an operating system you didn't read the patch notes for. The spending feels justified because it's incremental, not reckless, which makes it almost impossible to question. You're not chasing happiness, you're maintaining a moving standard of normal that keeps drifting upward. And as long as that process stays automatic, next will always feel necessary rather than optional. Number 7, the arrival fallacy undermines long-term satisfaction. What if the thing you're waiting for is the reason you feel stuck right now? There's a deeply comforting belief that once you hit a certain milestone, 6 figures, a paid-off house, a net worth with commas, you'll finally relax. That belief has a name, and it's been politely lying to people for a very long time. The arrival fallacy is the idea that happiness lives at the destination, not in the process of moving toward it. But research keeps finding that people feel most alive when they're making progress, not when they've crossed something off a list. Once the goal is reached, the structure that gave your effort meaning disappears, and your brain immediately looks around like, okay, now what? So you can spend years sprinting toward a finish line that emotionally dissolves the moment you touch it, which would just be disappointing if it didn't also quietly affect what you choose to spend money on. Number 8. Experiences deliver more lasting happiness than possessions. Why do things you buy stop feeling special faster than trips you barely planned? Experiences are harder for your brain to flatten into background noise because they live as memories, not objects collecting dust. They also tend to involve other people, which turns out to matter more than square footage, despite what real estate listings suggest. A vacation becomes a story you retell, a concert becomes a reference point, and a shared disaster becomes a bonding exercise. Objects, on the other hand, just sit there waiting to be outperformed by a newer version. What makes this worse is that experiences are often cheaper than the material upgrades they replace. So we end up overspending on things that fade quickly and underspending on things that linger. And once you notice that mismatch, it raises an awkward question about how upgrades should actually work. Number 9, practical strategies to step off the treadmill. What if the solution isn't making more money, but deciding what more money is allowed to do? One way to interrupt the autopilot is to set a rule in advance for future raises, before excitement starts spending it for you. You decide ahead of time how much of an increase goes toward lifestyle and how much disappears into investments without discussion. This doesn't eliminate upgrades, it just forces them to be intentional instead of reflexive. The strange side effect is that the upgrades you do choose feel better because they're chosen, not assumed. Meanwhile, the rest of the money quietly builds distance between you and the need to keep running. It's not dramatic or exciting, which is usually how you know it works. Number 10, psychological and financial tools to counter adaptation. Have you ever tried imagining losing your life just to make it feel tolerable again? There's a practice where you deliberately picture losing the things you've already adapted to, your job, your apartment, your routines, not to be dramatic, but to interrupt how invisible they've become. It sounds dark, but it works because your brain can't adapt to imagined loss as easily as it adapts to real upgrades. For a brief moment, what you have feels less like baseline and more like something that could vanish, which resets appreciation without buying anything. There's also the quieter shift of optimizing for time instead of money, which feels wrong until you realize money mostly exists to eventually stop needing it. Spending less and investing more isn't about winning capitalism. It's about slowly buying back hours you don't have to sell later. It's not exciting, and it doesn't look impressive online, but it's one of the few ways to make progress without needing the finish line to cooperate. So the problem was never that you couldn't make enough money. It was that money was quietly doing its job a little too well, smoothing things out, just enough to feel normal again. Nothing here means you failed or lack discipline or secretly hate yourself, even though that's the explanation most of us default to. This is just what happens when ancient brains run modern financial software with no update notes. Awareness doesn't magically fix it either, which is uncomfortable, because noticing the treadmill doesn't stop it from moving. You still live inside the system, you're just slightly more conscious of how often it nudges you forward. And once you start paying attention to that, you begin noticing where the money actually goes. Not in theory, but in monthly contractual reality. Which is usually when something like your car payment starts feeling less like transportation and more like a long-term emotional subscription. Not because it's evil or irresponsible, but because it's one of the cleanest examples of how small, reasonable decisions quietly lock in future trade-offs. That's a separate explanation, but it's connected in a way that tends to reveal itself only after you've already signed the paperwork.